He walked away from the old life. He found peace on a quiet farm and love by a hidden waterfall. But when his past comes roaring back in fire and burns, how far will he go to protect it all? Endless Waterfall is a story of second chances, redemption, and a love strong enough to survive the flames. Chapter 13. Retaliation. The light was beginning to fade into evening when Lana pulled open the door of the caravan. The hinges creaked softly. Joe had promised to oil them but hadn't gotten around to it. That small sound hit her with an unexpected pang. "Joe?" she called quietly, peeking her head in. No answer. Inside, the air was still, almost too still. The bed was neatly made, the kettle unplugged, the mug she'd brought him 3 mornings ago washed and sitting upside down in the drying tray, but something was wrong. She stepped in, her eyes scanning the compact space. His backpack was gone. Some of his clothes were missing from the wardrobe. His shoes that usually sat just inside the door, gone too. Her heart sank. Then she saw the note, folded and sitting on the edge of the pillow. She snatched it up, fingers trembling. "Lana, there's something I need to take care of. I didn't want to drag you or your family into it again. Joe." Lana sat slowly on the bed, the note clutched in her lap like something broken. The sunset painted the window in streaks of orange and rose, but she didn't see it. Her mind spiraled. He left. He left. She read the words again, but they didn't feel like reassurance. They felt like goodbye, like the beginning of something reckless, or the end of something fragile and real. Her breath caught in her throat, and before she realized it, tears had welled in her eyes and slipped silently down her cheeks. Main house. 10 minutes later, Lana sat stiffly at the kitchen table, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The note lay in the center, flat and accusatory under the bright overhead light. Angie hovered near the stove, stirring gravy with one hand but glancing over constantly, her forehead pinched with worry. Robert leaned against the bench, jaw clenched, arms folded. He didn't say where he went. He asked, voice low but tense. Lana shook her head. "Nothing." "Just this. Left with his gear?" Robert asked. "Clothes," she said. He took the backpack. Angie put the spoon down a little too hard. "He should have told someone. He should have stayed," Lana said, biting the words. "We trusted him. After everything." "And he just disappears?" "He may come back," Angie offered gently. "No one writes a note like that if they're just popping into town," Lana snapped. "He's gone. He left. Maybe. Maybe he couldn't face it. Maybe the guilt got too heavy." She wiped at her eyes, frustrated by the tears she couldn't seem to stop. "I thought we were rebuilding something," she whispered. I thought he loved me." Robert's face was unreadable. "Maybe he did. Maybe that's why he left." Lana looked up sharply. "That's not love. Walking away in silence? After everything we've been through?" Robert exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. "Or maybe he went to do something for you." Angie sat down beside her daughter, resting a hand lightly on her knee. "Love makes people do all sorts of crazy, sweetheart." Lana just shook her head. "Or it makes them run when things get too real." Later that night, the caravan sat quiet, untouched. The animals were fed, and the lights in the main house were dimmed. Lana stood outside under the stars, Joe's note in her hand. The night breeze stirred the hem of her cardigan, her bare feet rooted in the cool grass. She looked up at the sky, tears drying slowly on her cheeks. "Please come back," she whispered. And across the fields far beyond the hills, past the burn scars and the waterfall that still flowed, Joe was already in motion. Driven by love, by rage, and by a need to finish what should never have touched this family. But to Lana, he was just gone. And all she had now was an empty space where hope had been. Into the hut. The sun had already begun to sink behind the hills when Joe stepped off the last ride and onto the outskirts of Lower Hutt. He'd hitched from the farm to Wellington, in 3 rough hauls. 1 truckee, one quiet divorcee in his Subaru, and a guy in a rusted van who didn't ask questions. Joe had said little, kept his backpack on his knees, and stared out the windows as farmland gave way to the cracked concrete skin of the capital's hut valley. The scent of the hut never really changed. It still clung to him in a way nothing else did. The streets weren't unfamiliar. They were burned into his bones. This was where it had all started. Lower Hut. Beige streets, graffiti tags, cracked pavement, and cracked people. Deals on corners. Bruiser's laugh echoing off alleyways. Den's voice behind closed doors. Calm and cold, like a banker counting other people's debt. Den Morrison ran 30% of the drug trade through the Hut Valley. That wasn't street talk. It was fact. Meth, pills, coke, weed. He had a cut in it all. It was stitched through strip malls, repair shops, and laundromats. Clean fronts hiding dirty cash. Den didn't operate with tattoos and aggression. He ran it like a business. Real estate, laundered through property shells. A courier service that fronted drug runs. His runners weren't street punks. They were ghosts. Disposable. Controlled. Joe had been one of them once. He remembered it too clearly. The pattern of it. The ritual of it. Joe would wake in a cold flat behind an old boxing gym on High Street. No sunlight. Just iron bars and damp walls. By 7 a.m., he'd have his burner phone charged, routes memorized, and a small duffel of powder or pills strapped to his back. Den didn't like late starts. A car would pick him up. Sometimes Bruiser driving, sometimes Oscar or Nigel, and he'd be dropped near a corner shop or a quiet cul-de-sac. The location was always shifting. No patterns. That was Den's rule. Drop the bag, collect the envelope. You don't stay longer than 60 seconds. Joe would walk, head down, eyes forward. Handoffs were fast. Behind bins, under benches, one shake and done. He wasn't supposed to talk. If the buyer stalled or asked questions, he walked away. Then the afternoon would hit. Heat rising from the footpaths, boots aching, nerves raw from staying alert. Joe would call it in. Wait. A second bag. A second route. Repeat. Some days 5 runs, some days 10. Den kept tabs on every delivery. Every gram. If the weight didn't match, you got a visit. At night, they'd gather in Den's warehouse office. A dimly lit room with steel cabinets, a wall of screens and maps. Den would sit at the desk like a CEO, feet up, clean-cut, shirt tucked. You'd never know he was a kingpin. He looked like someone who sold insurance, and he owned them. Fear wasn't loud in Den's world. It was quiet, precise. When someone crossed him, they didn't vanish. They were made an example of. Joe had seen it. Once, Den broke a man's kneecap in front of 10 of them. No yelling. No threats. Just silence. Then the sound of bones folding like paper. That was the life. No choices. No friends. Just transactions. And Joe had gotten out. But it seemed he hadn't escaped. Joe wore a black hoodie now, pulled over his head, and dark jeans. His hair was rougher, jaw tighter, eyes tired. But he was clearer than he'd been in months. This wasn't running. This was return. This was war. House of Smoke. It was just after midnight when Joe approached the house. A squat faded bungalow tucked away in a dead-end back street. Cracked paint peeled from the window frames, security cameras screwed crookily into the weatherboards. One flickered. Another was already busted. As he stood in the dark outside the house of Nigel and Oscar, men who'd once handed him bags and driven him to drop-offs. He could feel the past scraping against his ribs like knives. They thought they knew what loyalty meant. They had no idea what payback looked like. The house looked tired, lived in by ghosts and dealers, stinking of oil and tension. It had always been a pit stop in Den's network. Joe remembered it from his old life. Nigel and Oscar's place. Sloppy and unpredictable. They used to laugh like hyenas in Den's warehouse during pickups. They'd been there the night of the cottage fire. They'd watched the cottage burn. Joe pulled his black gloves on and adjusted his hoodie tighter around his face as he circled the back, hopping the fence silently. He moved like breath on glass. Controlled, barely there. Through the grimy windows, he saw the glow of blue light from a TV. A dull bass line thudded from somewhere inside. Laughter. Coughing. Someone moving between rooms. The back door was easily cracked open. Too lazy to lock it. Too arrogant. Joe slipped inside. The kitchen was small, chaotic. Plates with dried noodles, an ashtray overflowing, a stolen stereo pulsing low hip-hop beats. The hallway stretched ahead, 2 doors on either side, one at the end slightly ajar. The house reeked of weed, sweat, something chemical and sharp, cheap cologne and paranoia. Joe moved like a shadow ninja. From the first door, muffled voices. "I told Den we were sitting on too much product," Oscar muttered nervously. Nigel grunted. "Den doesn't care. He just wants to get paid. We have a big deal coming up this week, so less talk and more work." Joe stepped closer, pausing just beside the doorframe. He inhaled once, then pushed the door open. Oscar froze. Mid-sentence, a small bag of powder in his hand. Nigel stood behind a makeshift counter, a pistol on the bench beside the scales. Joe's eyes locked onto them. Nigel's face showed surprise before descending into a smirk. Well, the prodigal returns. I thought you'd be crispy." Or halfway to Auckland crying into a bottle. Oscar backed up, hands raised, already trembling. "Joe, hey." "Look, man, it wasn't personal," he stammered. "That night. Den said it was just scare tactics. I didn't even want to be there." Joe stepped forward. He didn't yell, didn't speak. He just stared. Oscar looked terrified. Nigel didn't flinch. He leaned casually on the counter, tattooed arms flexing beneath a black t-shirt. Stocky, bulked, all menace and intimidation. "You gonna cry at me, Taylor?" Nigel sneered. "Or you here to, what, lecture us? You think burning down that shed bought you redemption, a second chance with the gang?" Joe's voice was low, steady. "I'm not here for redemption from the gang." Nigel raised an eyebrow. "Then what? You want forgiveness?" Joe shook his head once. "I'm here to close the chapter," Nigel scoffed. "You hear that, Oscar? He wants to be done with us." Oscar gave out a nervous giggle. Nigel scowled at Joe. "You think you're faster or better than us?" "Tonight," Joe said, tone cold. "I am done with you." Oscar tried to step back again, nearly stumbling into a stack of plastic crates. "Joe, please, man. We were following orders. It was Den. Joe cut him off, eyes sharp. "You stood outside while we burned." Oscar's voice cracked. "I didn't know. I couldn't do anything. Den was there." "You knew what the fire was meant to do," Joe said. "And you laughed." Nigel reached slowly for the gun. Joe moved fast. Joe slammed into the counter, knocking the pistol wide. Nigel broke a beer bottle on the edge of the counter and waved it at Joe. He fought like a dog, swinging the broken bottle across Joe's arm, tearing fabric, drawing blood. But Joe didn't stop. He drove Nigel back, fists hammering into ribs, jaw, temple, throat. Oscar screamed and tried to run, but Joe was faster. He caught him by the collar and threw him into a glass cabinet. The sound of breaking glass and deep cuts filled the room. Oscar's body rebounded and hit the floor, cracking loudly. The bag of powder exploded open. There was screaming, gurgling, coughing, chaos. Oscar tried to crawl, his face dripping blood. Joe stepped over him. "No, Joe, please. I didn't even light it. I didn't want that." But Joe's expression didn't change. He looked down at the two of them, one gasping, one crawling, and saw what he already knew. There was no innocence here, no mercy that had ever been shown. He didn't come to bargain. He came for closure. Nigel, gasping for breath, clutching his throat, made another attempt to go for the pistol on the floor. Joe didn't hesitate. Everything after that was chaos. Fast, sharp, final. And then he used the gun, muffled in a cushion, on Oscar, who pleaded till the final moment. Joe dropped the pistol next to Oscar's departing figure. He stood over the blood-streaked carpet, chest heaving, arm wound burning. He didn't feel triumphant. Only the silence that comes when noise has finally been answered. Joe walked slowly down the hallway, blood cooling on his shirt, hands steady despite the pulse pounding in his ears. Behind him, the silence of 2 lives ended. There was no satisfaction in it, just a grim, necessary stillness. After cleaning and bandaging his arm wound in the bathroom, he turned toward the rooms off the hallway. The first door on the left swung open to reveal a bedroom that had been converted into a stash site. The bed frame had been tossed aside to make room for metal crates and plastic bins. Everything labeled with duct tape and marker, bags of white powder, vacuum-sealed pouches of weed, boxes of pills and blister packs, and tiny glass vials with black caps. This wasn't just personal use. This was distribution scale. Joe crouched by a metal cabinet, yanked open the drawer. A steel safe sat inside the base, tucked behind a false panel. He recognized it. The same model Den used at the warehouse office. Joe remembered the combination code. A few twists. Then the safe gave way with a muted click. Inside was cash. Stacks of it, bound in thick rolls, 20s and 50s. Joe counted roughly, at least $20,000. He grabbed a duffel bag from the corner of the room, swept the money in fast. Beneath the bundles were weapons, 2 Glock pistols, 2 full mags, and a black tactical knife with a serrated edge. He took the lot. It wasn't greed. It was preparation. This wasn't the end. Den was still out there. And Joe would need everything he could carry. He slung the duffel bag over his shoulder and moved to the second room. This one reeked of humidity and potting mix. The lights buzzed. Overhead hydroponic rigs casting a sterile glow over rows of waist-high marijuana plants. The whir of the vent fans, the clunk of a dehumidifier, the hum of artificial life in a house full of death. Joe looked at the plants, at the plastic jugs of nutrients and chemical containers stacked against the walls. There were enough explosives in this room alone for what he had planned. Joe checked out the laundry space where he spotted the red jerry can in the corner. Petrol, still full. He picked it up, no hesitation. He unscrewed the cap and started splashing the fuel across the carpet, the curtains, the door frames, the furniture. The fumes spread fast. The sickly, sweet chemical sting burned in his nose. He whispered it to the room. "You always said loyalty mattered. Den, I'm showing you mine." He paused in the hallway, gave one last glance toward the lifeless bodies in the other room. Oscar, Nigel. "The Crown wants evidence," Joe muttered. "They'll bury this too." He found a lighter on the arm of the couch. It flared with one flick, orange and alive. Joe dropped it onto the soaked floor. The fire caught instantly. Raced across the carpet, crawled up the curtains, devoured the house like it had been waiting for an excuse. Joe stepped out the back door, the bag heavy on his shoulder, the heat already kissing his back. By the time he reached the end of the alley, flames had started to lick through the windows. Glass popped, smoke poured into the sky. Then, the occasional big boom shook the neighborhood. Joe didn't look back. Minutes later, down the block, Joe sat on a low brick wall, breathing slowly, watching black smoke climb above the rooftops in the distance. The sirens of first responders were sounding in the distance. He opened the bag on his lap. Money. The money was for Lana and her rehabilitation. Guns. A new edge in the war. He wasn't just sending a message to Den. He was erasing his foundation. And this time, Joe was doing the knocking. Stay updated on J. Pilgrim's latest releases and more by following him on this YouTube channel. Join a community of readers who are inspired, entertained, and transformed by the works of J. Pilgrim. Like, comment, and share this series with fiction lovers. Discover the magic, embrace the wisdom, live the adventure. See you in the next episode.